Oh, howdy all, grab yourselves a beer, it is time for some Path of Exile discussion. Today is a major news day for the Blight League that's coming out this weekend. It's coming out Saturday morning my time. It may be on Friday your time. And we got the Balance Manifesto, the development manifesto on balance. So we've already had some other news. We had the Zana mods revealed, which make up a huge amount of information that influences decisions that you make when you're at endgame. Well, the development manifesto influences other decisions that you make, but it influences ones that you make while you're designing your character before you start playing with a league. So I want to go through these changes, give my thoughts on what's going on. Firstly, we've got a discussion of global gem levels. And this is sort of being teased from the point at which they revealed the Cold Iron Point unique dagger. So, for a while we've wanted to include modifiers on caster weapons that provide a multiplicative damage increase to spells, similar to how physical weapon modifiers affect the base damage of attacks. Previously, this took the form of elemental penetration and modifiers that add a portion of elements as chaos damage. But in this patch we'll be pushing this further in the form of global modifiers to gem levels. Now, firstly, I think the idea of having multiplicative damage increases on weapons is a good one. The reason I like this is that it increases the cost, the opportunity cost, of using some of the extremely powerful modifiers available, like Bloodstained Fossil modifiers that exist that will give you an extreme amount of utility on weapons. A lot of the time, casters, they first and foremost focus on getting utility on their weapons. So there's a Bloodstained Fossil, there's even using a Hollow Fossil in a weapon has been popular in the past. I think that's pretty much going to be dead now, and people will instead want to go for raw damage using these new modifiers. So, staves will previously be the go-to weapon for increasing gem levels, but their modifiers only apply to gems within the staff. And ultimately, that was fairly limited in its use. You could get +2 to fire gems and +1 to all gems on a staff for +3 total. But that came at a big cost, because then your staff doesn't have any more mods on it than just those two. Well, it doesn't have many more mods on it than those two. And so you wound up in a situation where you're investing a lot of effort on your staff into amping up the damage of the skill that's within it, and then you wind up with basically no bonuses to other skills. So, caster-oriented one-handers will now be able to roll some new modifiers that grant +1 to all fire, cold, lightning, physical, or chaos spell skill gems, not just to one socketed in the item. Now, scepters, for thematic reasons, won't have the chaos option available. Staves will be able to roll a modifier that grants +1 to +2 instead, and will also have a rarer, higher tier +3 modifier available. Now, on top of this, one-handed caster weapons will be able to roll a very rare additional mod that grants +1 to all spell gems, and the staff version of that rare modifier will grant +1 to +2 to all spell gems. And these weapons will no longer be able to roll equivalent modifiers that only apply to socketed gems. So what does this mean in practice? This means that if you have low-end caster gear, you can expect to have a +1 to all fire gems. I'll just say without loss of generality that you're talking fire. +1 to all fire gems in each hand, and so that's going to be a total of +2. At medium gear level, you'll be able to get +3 on a staff, so that'll be something that you'll be able to to pick up. So there's a clear upgrade path there. And then at much higher gear level, if you're going with the one-handers route, you can have +1 to fire and +1 to universal skills, spell skills in one hand and the same in the other, or conceivably have +3 to spell skills, to say fire skills in a staff, and +2 to spell skills in a staff for a total of +5. That's the dream for a staff spellcaster, and it gives staves a little bit of an identity again. It means, because currently staves are, generally speaking, they're a weak option for casters. Now there's a real potential for them to be good, at least to have a niche. It's worth noting these new modifiers don't apply to support gems. So, sorry, added chaos support, sorry, added cold damage support. The support gems that scale a lot with gem level, you're just not going to want to use those with these. Decay support being another one. I just don't think they're going to be of any real merit to use on alongside these new gems. Daggers and Warstaves that can't roll caster modifiers will still be able to roll the old local elemental gem modifiers, and all non-caster weapon types will still be able to roll any existing local gem modifiers like +1 to socketed bow gems. So this is interesting. This means that this is probably the end of casters defaulting to using bows. There will still be people who use bows for caster weapons, but they will not be dealing the most damage. There'll be a severe opportunity cost to doing things like trying to amp up your, let's say, using a 6-link bow that has been crafted with a Deafening Essence of Rage. I think you only need a Shrieking Essence, actually, to get +2 to the level of fire skills, and then using that in conjunction with Rigwald's Quills. That's an option. It'll give you some really powerful fireballs out of your bow, and they'll fork because of Rigwald's Quills, but you're then paying a severe opportunity cost because with that level of gear you could have potentially gone for a +5 staff instead. So, staves should be the default caster weapon, I think, but I need to see exact numbers, and also need to see some information on the rarity of these rare rolls. There's a very big difference between, for instance, if the extra +1 to 2 gems on spell gems on staves, that when they say very rare, is that as rare as the Dexterity Stacking Shaper bow mod, which is quite rare, or is it as rare as the Merciless mod on a physical damage weapon, which is extraordinarily rare? We don't know that yet. Undoubtedly, that'll get data mined quite quickly. The number of consequences of these changes. Because the global gem modifiers are much more powerful than the previous local mods, we've removed the low-level crafting recipe that added +1 to the level of socketed fire, cold, lightning, and chaos gems. That's unfortunate, but there is something new that partially replaces it. This will be sorely missed in racing, but people will adapt, people will overcome, people will find something new. This recipe has been replaced with a similar one that applies added fire, cold, or lightning damage to spells, and takes the rarity of the item into account to determine the mod's tier. There is currently no replacement for the Chaos recipe. Now, when they're saying the Chaos recipe has a specific meaning in Path of Exile normally. They're not talking about that, they're talking about the recipe above here. Now, oh, that's interesting. Essences of Rage, Sorrow, and Spite now apply fire, cold, and lightning penetration, respectively, to weapons. So this is an interesting change. These were ones that I thought might stick around with +2 gem levels. So, for instance, Deafening Essence of Rage. Deafening Essence of Rage may now actually be worth using on a weapon. Previously, Shrieking was where it capped out. So that's an interesting change there. Some uniques have been changed to apply modifiers to global gem levels. This is mostly the case on caster weapons, but some specific minion items like Bones of Ula have also received this treatment. Bones of Ula, and I hope I'm not pronouncing that right, but I don't really care, now grants +1 to all raised zombie gems and all raised spectre gems instead of affecting the maximum minion count, as the additional maximum spectres modifier was too much power from a single item. Now, raising the level of these minion gems to a high enough level will sometimes grant additional maximum minions, so these mods are still useful. All changes will be shown in the patch notes. One that I'm particularly interested in, there's a number of Delve exclusive rare mods that, so you'll get, just like the Incursion Temple has various mods, various items that drop pre-rolled as rare items with modifiers you can't otherwise get. So an example of that is Tacites, which is a weapon prefix that adds a lot of physical damage and also adds physical as added chaos. It's the most powerful of the Merciless Tyrannical series of weapon affixes, and it's something that's only available through the Incursion Temple. The Delve mines have some very rare nodes that do the same thing. We're really interested to see what happens to those mods, because some of the minion ones did add additional minions. So perhaps it'll be possible to get +1 to level of Spectre Gems on your chest or something like that. We'll have to find that out. That'll be in the patch notes, so that's another day's time. Now, we have a section on traps and mines. We made a whole host of changes to mines that completely change how they behave and how you interact with them. As such, many systems that interact with them have been changed, and I've made a video on this earlier as well. The Shape Ronaldo modifiers that granted +1 trap thrown or +1 mines placed will no longer appear. It provided too much of a damage increase for a single mod. To compensate, some traps have had their damage and area growth improved. That will be interesting to see. We're also introducing changes to trap support, which now grants a higher value of trap throw speed and an increase to trap damage as the gem levels. So that means that trap support spell traps may get quite a boost out of this. The Saboteur Ascendancy had left people nervous that traps may be in a weaker place than they were. Mines are basically a totally new build than they used to be. Traps are still recognizably the same fundamental build, but people had felt that they may be weaker. I have to see the numbers on this. I think that there's no reason that you can't play a trapper early in the new league. They've always been strong at league start, and it seems like they're getting a few new bonuses. There's some changes, some gains here, some losses there, but I think they'll still be very strong. We've included a couple of new modifiers from various kinds of crafting to improve trap and mine itemization. As an example, Essence of Zeal now rolls a trap and mine throw speed modifier on belts. I think this might be so good that it feels mandatory. That is basically cast speed on a spot that you wouldn't have otherwise got anywhere near as much damage from. So, although belts do have a lot of damage potential on them, I have to see the numbers on that, but I think that could be very strong. Two-handed incursion weapons with trap damage modifiers now have values higher than one-handed incursion weapons, which needed to happen, and the bonuses apply to mine damage as well. Now that will be significant. We'll also buff some underutilized trap supports like charged trap supports and advanced trap supports. Okay, so this sounds interesting. Need to see numbers to be certain on it, but I wasn't intending to league start with traps. I've done that in the past. I'm still open to league starting with the new mines. I know there's a lot of people are apprehensive about them, but I think they could be quite good. Damage over time. Now this is transformative here. We've made a number of changes to improve the itemization and passive tree power for builds that use ailments to deal damage, as well as damage multipliers for burning skills. These are big changes, and they will transform a number of builds. I think that these changes will make the Poison Critical Strikes Assassin potentially viable. I discussed that a bit in my video on the Assassin yesterday. There will also be a number of other things that are changing here. Righteous Fire is going to be totally transformed and be an unrecognizable build, I think. But let's go through the rest of this. We've replaced all non-ailment Chaos Damage over time multipliers with Chaos Damage over time multiplier. So they'll now apply to poison as well. I love this line. This is partially so that poison builds have a few interesting new options, but mostly to make those passives and items less painful to read. And yes, I mean, we always called it Nakdodum. It was a good mod, but Nakdodum is a ridiculously long name. Given that we already abbreviated what's now called elemental damage with attacks, but had previously been called weapon elemental damage, that generally gets abbreviated by players as WED. If we're going to abbreviate something as short as elemental damage with attacks, then you can damn well be sure that we're going to abbreviate non-ailment chaos damage over time multiplier. And unfortunately, Kadotum doesn't really roll off the tongue that well, but oh well, we're stuck with it. Maybe it'll just get called Chaos DOTM or something like that. So it's actually harder to pronounce than it used to be, which is a funny side effect of the change. Perfect Agony has been changed significantly, and as a result, so have ailments from crits. Previously, ailments from crits dealt 50% more damage by default, similar to unmodified critical hit damage. The only way to modify this damage was to take Perfect Agony. Now, ailments from crits have a plus 50% to damage over time multiplier by default, which will be additive with damage over time multipliers from other sources. Now, Perfect Agony lets Critical Strike multiplier also apply to ailment damage over time multiplier at 50% of their value, which is more potent than the previous value of 30%. So what this means is that under the old system, if you had 200% increased Critical Strike multiplier, so you had you start with 50%. You start with 150% is your base Critical Strike multiplier. But if you had found other sources to increase that by 200%, so your crit multi is 350%, then Perfect Agony would give you 60% to the 60% damage multiplier to your critical strike poisons. What this is changing to is now you get a 100% bonus to critical strike poisons. So you go from 150% of base to 250% of base. This is a buff. It's a smallish one, but it is real. And I think it is definitely the case that this makes investing in critical multiplier more rewarding for ailment builds, unless you've already invested heavily in other sources of damage over time multiplier. So it means that critical strike multiplier is an option, but is not mandatory for these builds. And it's going to take a lot of maths to work out whether it's worth going for critical strike multiplier or not. I think that you will probably take the low-hanging fruit critical strike multiplier nodes, the best stuff, and see how it goes. So the intention of this change is to allow critical poison builds to have more potential for damage growth and make the Keystone a worthwhile investment for any critical bleed or ignite build. Yes, so that also, of course, applies to critical bleeds, which have been in a very bad place for a long time, and to critical ignites. The other option, of course, is to just get Perfect Agony when you need it from the Corralito's signature unique Diamond Flask, which I think might see quite a bit more use in 3.8 than it's been seeing lately. Many passives that increase burning damage, poison damage, or bleeding damage now have equivalent damage over time multiplier bonuses. They've all been rebalanced as a result, and we've added a small cluster that gives some potent bonuses to ignites from crits, and another that gives bonuses to all ailments from crits. This sounds impressive. There's certainly going to be more options to inflict scary burning damage with fireball crits and the like in the future. It's something that hadn't really been viable for a while. Generally speaking, any character that was specializing in igniting was probably taking Elemental Overload in the past. Elemental Overload will probably still be a very compelling choice for those builds, but so should crit scaling as well. I'm interested to see how this plays out in practice. There are also some new item modifiers and crafting mods that apply to fire damage over time multiplier or ignite damage over time multiplier to give burning builds options closer to cold damage over time and chaos damage over time builds. So this should be good. This hopefully is a fix to some of the weaknesses of ignite as a mechanic. As a result of all these burning changes, we have reviewed all burning damage skills and adjusted values. And Righteous Fire. Righteous Fire in particular has received some mechanical changes. RIP to some people who loved playing this skill. Although I don't think it's been destroyed, I just think it'd be a slight nerf. It now deals a smaller portion of your health as fire damage to enemies around you, but it has an additional burning damage that increases as the gem levels. The goal of this change is to provide more powerful builds that don't invest as heavily in stacking every possible source of max life, and a bit less power in builds that invested all of their resources into getting large values of max life. So basically, if you're running 8,000 life on your Righteous Fire build, expect things to be the same. If you're running 11,000, expect to deal less damage. If you're running 6,000, expect things to be better. At least that's my sort of guess. So I'm not involved in actually designing these changes. I'm just going off what's listed on the manifesto. We've also rebalanced some supports that affect damage over time, like Unbound Element support, Poison support, and the Vicious Projectile support. That means we need to see the numbers. They're coming out tomorrow. I believe it's tomorrow. Maybe it's 2 days from now. Minions. We've made a large number of additions and changes to minions to improve build diversity and give players the option of having more control over their armies. You can read about some of them here, and I've made videos on the Necromancer Ascendancy, and also touching a bit on the question of minions when talking about Cold Iron Point. Almost every system in the game that touches minions has been reviewed and rebalanced or changed. Here are some of the more notable changes. All minions have had their accuracy increased. The result of this is that at a level 20 Raised Zombie, Summon Skeleton, or Raging Spirit will have an 80% chance to hit a level 84 enemy if you have no minion accuracy modifiers. There are several ways to get minion accuracy now. There's the Precision Aura. There is a Gloves Commander the Pit, I believe it's called. It's one that drops from one of the Delve bosses anyway. It's not really available early in a league, but it does become pretty widely available after a while. And there's other options as well. Golems have all been reviewed or adjusted to make more varieties of golems have competitive levels of power. Chaos Lightning and Stone Golems have been improved in various ways to make them more competitive with Flame and Ice Golems. I like this a lot because actually Lightning and Stone Golems have been the ones I tend to use the most. A Stone Golem while leveling is just amazing just for the passive regen. It does taper off a lot at endgame, but it is really strong while leveling. Lightning and Stone Golem, Lightning Golem has incredibly good buffs as well. In terms of their combat abilities, though, those three golems are all rat shit. So Flame and Ice Golems are the ones that deal the most damage, and then there is the new Carrion Golem. As an example, Chaos Golem has more area of effect on its Cascade, has 100% of physical converted to Chaos, and its ongoing Chaos Storm has spell damage modifiers apply to this skill's damage over time, in addition to damage adjustments. Okay, that sounds interesting. So Golems may no longer be a passive buff bot that ends up causing trouble when you get into maps. It may be something that is actually, if not a companion that fights alongside you, at least something that does a little bit of meaningful damage and maybe clears up some of the monsters that you haven't killed. Okay, if you're targeting a monster when you cast Summon Raging Spirit, a Raging Spirit created will attempt to attack that enemy first. That's a magnificent change. If it can't reach the enemy or the enemy dies, it returns to its standard behavior, and this is still overridden by the Death Mark support. Magnificent change there. The Minion and Totem Elemental Resistance support has been changed to Elemental Army support. No longer applies to totems, but lets supported minions apply a 10% exposure based upon their highest elemental damage dealt, and grants them more elemental damage. At higher levels, it also grants them more maximum elemental resistances. So, Righteous Fire Totems, sorry. Righteous Fire Totems, sorry. I think you're kaput now. But these changes should be really good for anyone that is not playing a Righteous Fire Totem build. So to those 3 or 4 people that are still playing a build that was magnificent about 3 years ago, sorry, your little pet has just, your little baby has just been drowned. But for everyone else, that should be a good change. Convocation's cooldown has now been shortened, now that the Necromancer no longer has a notable that grants 50% cooldown, 100% cooldown recovery to it. Its life recovery is now a percentage of maximum life rather than a flat value, letting it scale to higher levels a bit better. This is going to be a really good change. Convocation is a skill that really does need a low cooldown to be effective, and 3.08 seconds, which was the 23 quality Convocation gems cooldown, if you didn't have any Shaper items granting further cooldown reduction, was probably a little bit too infrequent for this really powerful utility gem. Of note, the life recovery is now going to be meaningful on it, because previously it wasn't beyond about minimal levels. Desecrate has had its cooldown removed and now has a shorter cast time. It has a shorter duration and a lower corpse limit now, but this will make it a more reliable tool both for minion builds and for builds that explode corpses. You know what else this will do with Desecrate? It will stop people being able to harass you in your hideout. If you get invited to someone's hideout and you spam Desecrate everywhere, you can get the hideout so full of corpses that player, if their connection is a bit dicey, that they can just crash over and over again when they try and go in there. So Desecrate as a harassment tool has been nerfed into oblivion, and it should also be more powerful for people that want to use it for what it's designed for. Offerings are now more reliable and easier to manage, so this is your offering skills. They now have a higher base duration, grant an additional second for each corpse consumed, consume half as many corpses, have an ongoing marker over the player rather than on the ground, so you'll always know when they expire. Okay, this is really significant. If you watch my video on the Necromancer Ascendancy overhaul, you would have noticed that I was apprehensive about a lot of the corpse consumption skills, and the reason for that was that all of the main corpse consumption skills, such as the offerings, or as Val Detonate Dead I think is one of them as well, all of the main corpse consumption skills would end up consuming everything in a radius, and therefore would turn off a lot of the skills that were based upon you being near a corpse. This completely solves that problem, and so I'd be willing to reassess those nodes at this point. The Dead Reckoning unique duel can now turn up to 15 Skeleton Warriors into mages, up from 5, and is now limited to 1. Using multiple copies of the duel was an unnecessary cost for the power provided, and this should make the build more accessible as well. I've never played with Skeleton Mages. I don't know how good they are or what particular role they serve, but certainly sounds like it'll be something that will be a considerable power boost to characters using it, because instead of using 3 copies of Dead Reckoning, they can now use 1 copy and 2 powerful Abyss duels or 2 powerful Minion-themed duels. There have also been many changes to crafting modifiers that affect minions, including a new Atlas-specific base type, the Convoking Wand, which has an implicit that will allow it to roll new minion modifiers. These look really, really strong, and I'm expecting that there will be a lot of interest in acquiring these and rolling them up with bound fossils over the next league. So yeah, these could be really, really good. Essence of Fear has been changed to match other minion bonuses, which means that it grants higher values of increased minion damage on weapons. So Deafening Essences of Fear will probably be something a lot of players want. Unfortunately, Essence isn't in the Zana mods this league, so there's not going to be any really reliable way to get these unless they drop like candy from the Blight League mechanics. Legion did drop a significant number of essences. I don't think there's going to be all that many, with the changes to how Legion's implemented, I don't think there's going to be all that many of the Infused Incubator, I believe it was called, in circulation, the one that drops an item that is an essence item, a valuable essence item. So I don't think there'll be many of them around, but it's entirely possible. The last few leagues have all had significant ways of getting essences, so maybe there'll be a good number of them floating around. Incursion item minion modifiers have been changed and improved. Thank you for the reminder that those existed. I've probably vended a lot of them because they've just been utter trash. A new elemental resistance and minion elemental resistance crafted modifier has been added. This is going to be great. This will certainly find a use. And a new craftable minion movement speed modifier has been added. Again, this is going to be really good. Now let's talk something controversial, mana for spellcasters. In 3.7, we changed Warlord's Mark to only apply its leech effects to attacks, as Mana Leech was one of the easiest ways to recover mana for intelligence characters, outclassing most other mana recovery mechanics with very little cost. In 3.8, we've doubled down on this. We've changed all remaining sources of Mana Leech, either replacing the stats or changing them to leech only from attacks. This includes enchantments, the Mana Leech support, and unique items. The general philosophy is that mana sustain for spellcasters should be something a player has to think about and find some way to manage, similar to accuracy for attack characters. However, we don't want the solution to be a huge investment, and we've tried to provide a few different and interesting ways to sustain mana recovery. Essentially, this is going to result in more players needing to use a mana flask, Lavinia's Spirit being the most powerful of them, or needing to use Vile Clarity. This is a significant opportunity cost because that mana flask, let's say it's Lavinia's Spirit that you end up using, that may replace a damaging flask like Atziri's Promise, or it may replace a powerful defensive flask like any of a number that exist. And especially because we've just had the Synthesis Flask Bottled Faith re-added to the game, even if you were fine with a mana flask in 3.7, Synthesis Flask existing means that there is definitely a very real opportunity cost to using a mana flask. Alternately, using Vile Clarity is certainly an option, but that means that you have considerably less access to other Vile skills, such as Vile Righteous Fire, which is popular with casters as well. So there's a considerable, whichever solution you take, there is a considerable opportunity cost to it. However, mana flasks have received a major review. Values have been adjusted because, to be honest, one of the big problems with mana flasks was they provided very little mana, recovering more mana and having more uses available, so they're more reliable for longer encounters. We've introduced a selection of new modifiers for mana flasks, including a new enduring modifier that lets the mana flask remain after reaching full mana at the cost of duration. This is a huge change, and especially given that it sounds like it's a prefix, This means that you could then roll some sort of immunity on the suffix as well, and so you could reliably have access to this Enduring Mana Flask, which also provides some sort of immunity such as Staunching for bleeding immunity. Passives that affect Mana Flasks have been added or improved, including the new Essence Extraction notable that grants Mana Flasks 1 charge every 3 seconds, as well as Mana Regen, increase Flask charges gained, and removing 1 random elemental ailment when you use a Mana Flask. I don't think anyone cares about passive tree nodes that are related to Mana Flasks. You will use 1 Mana Flask if you have to on a build, and it will be Lavinia's Spirit if possible, or it will be an Enduring of Staunching or something like that. I don't think that anyone is going to take this Essence Extraction notable except as a mistake and as a bad decision. Stats are subtracted from the final mana cost of skills. This is an interesting line. Let's say this one again. Stats are subtracted from the final mana cost of skills, made managing mana for certain channeled skills far too simple. We've split these mods into a channeled and a non-channeled skill version, with the channeled skill version granting a much smaller reduction. Unlimited Cyclone, goodbye. Unlimited Cyclone is gone. This is actually probably the most significant change to Cyclone in 3.8. It's going to mean that Cyclone is going to have a non-trivial mana cost. It won't necessarily be a problematic one, but it's one that cannot be completely ignored by virtue of getting one Elrond mod on a ring. Ultimately, this is going to mean that this entire section is a slight reduce in character power so far, which is good because character power has eclipsed the content difficulty increases over recent times. So character power has been growing faster than content difficulty, and as a result, the game has been getting easier. This is a step back in the other direction. The reduced mana support has been reworked and is now the inspiration support. Yeah, that makes sense because reduced mana has had no identity since its old identity was taken and was put into the Enlightened gem years ago. In addition to reducing mana cost, it now grants an inspiration charge each time you spend mana with the supported skill, up to 5 charges. The supported skill now gains more elemental damage and critical strike chance for each inspiration charge. After spending more than a specified amount of mana, the inspiration charges are removed. This rewards you for investing in reducing the mana cost of your skills as much as possible to maximize the uptime of your inspiration. This may end up being solid. We need to see the numbers on this to be sure, and it certainly is going to have at least it looks like it's going to have a niche for where it could be useful. I'm just going to hold off on judgment on it. We'll have to see the numbers, whether it'll be useful or not. This one's a big one. Clarity has been changed to grant higher values of mana regen at higher gem levels. This has been needed. Clarity has just not been a very good aura for a long period. People have taken it because they've had a Watcher's Eye that uses it, and they've used tier 1 clarity, level 1 clarity. It's been pretty unpopular for a long time to use level 20 clarity. So maybe people will end up using clarity as their solution as to how they're going to manage mana on casters. And if level 20 is enough, then that'll be a positive thing. Again, it's all about opportunity cost. At that point, you're choosing to take clarity instead of using your mana reservation on something else. A variety of new passive tree classes have been added, including one that improves mana and Arcane Surge, one that gives curse bonuses and a way to recover mana after hitting or killing cursed enemies. That could be quite good, but mostly for the curse bonuses. And one that grants spell damage based on your maximum mana up to a limit. And they've learnt from Indigon. Indigon is what happens, or at least pre-nerf Indigon, so the version that existed from it wasn't in Abyss League, it was after Abyss League, from Bestiary up to and including Delve. Indigon was an absolutely broken helmet because its mods were not really capped. Its damage bonuses were not really capped by mana very effectively. Okay, so that's pretty transformative. Like I said, this is a slight decrease in character power across the board, and I'm on board with that because we are too powerful for the content that exists in the game at the moment. But it's going to take some adjusting and getting used to. I think it will be the right decision early in the league to use a mana flask, and then you'll see it as a major stepping stone in your character will be when you ditch the last mana flask. So that'll be a point at which your character significantly improves. I don't know when that'll be. That might be in the 80s, a level 80 range. It might be in the level 90 range that you get there. But I think that'll be something that will be a goal for most characters. Okay, now let's go. That's been one of the things that's undoubtedly going to be one of the more controversial changes it's made. Let's talk melee. 3.7.0 introduced a whole host of changes and improvements to a variety of melee skills. This resulted in a lot of people playing Cyclone. It is important to say that Legion was the most dominated by a single skill that I believe I have ever seen Path of Exile be. It's not even that Cyclone was the best build. It's that Cyclone was a solid build at high gear level. So it was a build that was extraordinarily strong at low gear level and that scaled up considerably as your gear improved. It wasn't as good at the top gear levels as Tornado Shot was, and we'll come back to Tornado Shot later, but it was still a very solid build at all gear levels and also had reasonably good clear speed. For that reason, Cyclone was fucking well everywhere, and the number of people playing Slayer Cyclones, it was something like 41% of all level 97 and higher characters at the end of the league were Slayers using Cyclone as a 5-link skill. Then the next biggest group was Berserkers using Cyclone as a 5-link or more skill. And the next biggest group, I believe, was Assassins using Cyclone as a way to trigger a payload of Ice Nova. So it gives you a sense as to just how ubiquitous Cyclone was. Cyclone benefited from a combination of melee range and area modifiers in a way that let it surpass the area of effect of almost any other skill outside all of the other benefits Cyclone has. Rather than punishing other skills that use melee range, we've changed how Cyclone calculates its area, making the increase granted additive with other area increases. In other words, RIP to Screen Cyclone, but Cyclone should still remain pretty solid, just will not scale nearly as high with the top levels of gear. This has meant that we've been able to provide more melee range on the passive tree. Master of the Arena, Brinkmanship, Bonebreaker, and Splitting Strikes all grant +2 melee range up from +1. Cleaving, Fraying, and Claws of the Pride now grant +1 melee range. This will improve the area of strike attacks, making them easier to use and more effective at taking on packs of enemies. As someone that league started with Glacial Hammer last league, and that was a big mistake, thank you, that would have made my experience tolerable. Ancestral Call support has had its damage penalty lowered, resulting in no damage penalty at level 20 of the gem. This is to further help the clearing capacity of strike attacks. Again, this is a change that will be a significant improvement. Ancestral Call is a bit clunky to use against bosses. Ultimately, the idea is that you would actually drop it out and replace it with something else, but in practice, that tends to be too much effort for what it's worth, except for the very toughest bosses in the game. We've increased the base damage of multi-strike while lowering the bonuses for the second and third swing, so the skill is much less punitive if you only perform 1 or 2 attacks. Multi-strike being cancelable is something we've decided to stick with to keep melee characters more mobile. Multiplicative attack speed is very dangerous from both clear capacity and performance, so we're reticent to give a single support gem anymore. Now, let's go through this quickly and say that multi-strike's problem is that cancelling it, it's not that it can be cancelled, it's that you can't set up a situation where you need to perform a special action to cancel it. I believe that multi-strike would be amazing if it couldn't be cancelled unless you cast a guard skill, or if it couldn't be cancelled unless you shift-click to move. But when you just click to move, or when you just hit right-click again and start your next multi-strike, all these things result in you unintentionally cancelling it too often. As a result, I don't think I'm going to recommend any builds use multi-strike in the short term. We've lowered the added physical damage on retaliation attacks because of how high their damage output could be when used with face breakers. The base damage has been increased to compensate. Really here I think that the problem is with the face breakers item itself. The face breakers is going to continue being a little problem causer over time, especially because it may well be that the Facebreaker's existence causes other melee skills' flat damage to be held down. I'd honestly rather they just nerf Facebreakers and maybe give Facebreaker a perhaps plus, give it an amount of flat physical damage on it. So maybe if you are level 75 or higher, you gain 20 flat physical damage, and then reduce the multiplier from 600 to 800 range to 500 to 600 range. That would be something that would make it still a compelling item, and I think would just be a better overall solution than changing around a lot of other skills because Facebreakers exist. Anyway, Pulverize support now provides increased area of effect instead of more area of effect. The skill provided too much area of effect for heavily invested characters, so we've changed the values to be additive with other area increases. The support now grants more damage than before to make up for the loss of area. Really hard to know how that's going to work out in practice, but you know, like you win some, you lose some. I think ultimately it probably makes the skill it probably makes the support gem weaker overall, but we need to see the numbers to be sure. Now let's talk ranged nerfs. So Tornado Shit has been outperforming other bow attack skills while also having potent single target damage. It's partially due to the power of the additional secondary projectiles enchantment. We've changed the enchantment to be from the Eternal Labyrinth only and to grant one secondary projectile down from +2. Yeah, this needed to happen. Ultimately, I think that enchant should have been removed entirely and that it should have been rolled into the gem at gem level 16 or something like that, because Tornado Shot is just one of those skills that doesn't feel very smooth until you get at least +1 and preferably +2 extra secondary projectiles on it. But once you get the +2, it's such a big bonus that having it in just the enchantment slot, it was too big a bonus to be in the enchantment slot. It's like, for instance, Cyclone has +40% attack damage or +15% attack speed as its enchants. If instead it had had +40% more Cyclone damage, that would be the sort of power boost that Tornado Shot's enchant granted the skill. It was utterly busted enchant, and it's been nerfed in the past because it was even more broken once. It needed the nerf that it got, and yeah, like I said, I would have preferred that it be completely removed and that this new bonus be rolled into the base gem. However, what's done is done. What's done is a solution to Tornado Shot being absurdly overpowered. This means that other range skills might be more compelling to use. We fixed a bug that... yes. We have fixed a bug that meant that secondary projectiles from Fork could hit the target that they forked from with certain skills. For players, this only applied to Tornado Shot and Barrage. This provided a huge unintended damage bonus to these skills. So not only is Tornado Shot getting an intended nerf, it's also getting a particularly broken interaction with Fork nerfed to high hell. This is going to be a tremendous decrease to the top end damage of Tornado Shot builds. And yeah, I think this all sounds like a bunch of very sensible changes. These needed to happen. I was intending to play Tornado Shot next league. I may not now, but I may also consider a different range skill because that you know, now it was the case that Tornado Shot obsoleted all of the others. That doesn't seem to be the case anymore, so I may well play something else. We've now granted additional lightning damage to Lightning Arrow and added cold damage to Ice Shot to help them scale better throughout the game, and improved damage and projectile scaling on Split Arrow. This could be good. These skills just didn't hold up once you got to high level. Maybe they will now, so maybe I'm inclined to try one of them. We've also made some improvements to how all projectiles select targets when chaining. Previously, 2 projectiles from a single attack could attempt to chain to the same target, but only one of them would be able to hit. Now, chaining projectiles won't attempt to chain to the same target unless no other targets are available, which significantly improves the clearing capabilities of chaining projectiles when used with additional projectiles. That's interesting. That's an additional power boost to chain support, which has been getting buffed a lot, and ultimately chaining as a mechanic is really strong already. This is an extra buff to it, makes it even better, and that'll be really interesting to see how that plays out in practice. Definitely, Ricochet from the Deadeye Ascendancy is one of the most powerful Ascendancy nodes in the game. The Shaper Bow mod that bow attacks chain bow attacks chain one additional time, or is it? No, its skills in this bow chain one additional time is one of the most powerful Shaper mods. And the Corrupted Quiver mod, the very rare Corrupted Quiver mod that grants +1 chain to skills. All of these are just incredibly powerful bonuses, and this makes them even better than they were. So that means that chaining projectiles are definitely looking like they may even be right at the top of my list of things that I want to play in the new league. Other spells. Contagion no longer gains radius as the gem levels. The spell provided too much clearing capacity over a large area at high levels. RIP Contagion. I think that may just be the end of Essence Drain Contagion's ability to be a superpowered skill. Body Swap has been significantly reworked, which is interesting because I'd forgotten this skill existed. The most notable change is that you can target a living enemy to warp to their location, though the skill benefits from more area of effect and a corpse explosion when destroying a corpse. There are other mechanical damage changes that make it a more flexible and powerful spell, especially when teleporting around a single target. This just needs to be seen in practice, and I'm just not sure what to say on it for the moment. Passive tree changes. We made a number of large changes to the passive tree in relation to mana, mines, bonuses for damage over time, poison, and more. The mine passives have been almost completely reworked. The damage over time and poison clusters now have different stats and values, and there are a number of new mana clusters found on the passive tree. We split the Flask effect cluster that was near the Witch into 4 different passive clusters, granting Flask effect alongside other effects. Wow. There goes the Alchemist cluster as one of the most powerful clusters in the game. That's going to be transformative. That is going to change the way that Vaal skill abuse builds are built. It's going to change the way that they gear themselves, and it's going to allow for there to be potentially well, it's actually a really big nerf to unique flasks in general. This is something I'm quite happy to see. I think that unique flasks have been getting too powerful in recent weeks. So these are spread over the passive tree with a preference towards the dexterity area of the tree, as the ranger has the strongest flask association. Each cluster has less flask effect than the old cluster, but in total there is now more flask effect on the passive tree than before. Okay, need to see the numbers on this, but this sounds like it'll be an interesting change. I think it sounds like it's overall a bit of a nerf, but like I said, it's one that needed to happen. We've raised the base radius of all traditional aura skills and lowered the bonus from increased area of effect of aura skills on the tree. This is because these passive stats will also apply to mine skills, as they also count as aura skills. Ah, yes, that makes a lot of sense. The passives are still great choices for mine characters, being more powerful than other generic area of effect increases, but they don't have values more than twice the numbers seen elsewhere. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So that's something I wouldn't have thought of, but yeah, mines would otherwise have potentially got too much. They would have basically got a massive boost in power from the old aura area nodes, which I think could give like 50% increased area of effect on some of the notables. We're also giving Smite more radius as the gem levels, as its area of effect was balanced around the aura area of effect passives. That is something that I'm also happy to see, because Smite's a skill that I want to be good. It's not good, but it's one that I want to be good. We've added a new power charge cluster similar to the Endurance and Frenzy charge ones added in 3.7.0. Clusters introduced in 3.7.0 that gave increased attributes have been moved, so they are no longer in the radius of any jewel sockets, as these clusters skewed the power of certain unique jewels too heavily. As a result, Tempered Flesh and Transcendent Flesh now have 7% per critical strike multi per unallocated strength in radius, up from 5%. Tempered Mind and Transcendent Mind now have 125 accuracy per unallocated intelligence in radius, up from 100. This should make them a more tempting choice in other locations on the tree. Yeah, this is a good change. They basically had been jewels that were limited to 1 or 2 locations each. Now they're more flexible, and their top end power is a little bit lower, which is fine because they were pretty absurd. Changes to Ascendancies. I've made a bunch of other videos going through each of these individually. This is getting so long that I won't go into any real depth here. other than to say that some of the notable changes to other ascendancies are listed. Our intent is to have fewer passives that take an underused skill or mechanic and give it the tools needed to see use. We're moving these effects onto the skills themselves as they level and providing more generally useful bonuses that still keep the same theme. Necromancer redesign is the most obvious example of this, and we've also changed the Guardian so that he no longer grants specific bonuses to Herald of Purity and Dominating Blow minions, and we've built Crusade Slam into the minions themselves. We're likely to do this further with future reworks. Hierophant's mana path has changed as a review of all mana mechanics. It should be more offensively powerful for a character with heavy mana investment now, with its defensive power slightly reduced. Elementalist has had its Golem path adjusted, providing more power to the player on much more power to a player on an invested Golem character, while no longer being the only way for a character to get additional Golems outside of uniques, thanks to a new Golem cluster on the passive tree. It should be a more desirable path for builds that don't rely entirely on their minions as a result. Beacon of Ruin now grants additional increased effect of non-damaging ailments to improve its overall power. So Beacon of Ruin, from memory, was the node in the Elementalist tree that was smashed with the nerf bat a couple of leagues ago, and that basically killed the Elementalist ascendancy. It took it from one of the most popular ascendancies to one of the least played, with just that one node being changed. The Raider received some numerical improvements, and by God were they big, and one additional aura mechanic to make it more competitive, but will receive more changes in the future to give it more unique features. Honestly, I'm already excited by the Raider changes. Even though a lot of other players are more interested in the changes to Assassin, I think that the Raider is just low-key really, really strong now. All it needed were the numbers, and it got the numbers. The numbers are where they need to be now, and I think that a Raider that is evasion tanking should be incredibly hard to kill, as well as being a real damage output machine. The Occultist Vile Bastion now grants 40 energy shield regen per second at all times, granting more reliable recovery, especially at lower levels. Yeah, that's nice, but it's not enough to make me want to play an Occultist now. Occultist needed the hit that it got with the nerf hammer, but it didn't need to be smashed 37 times in the face like it was. It just needed 3 solid hits to the head. As it is, I think Occultist was probably been dead for 6 minutes while it was still being bashed in the head with the nerf hammer last time. I don't think that just giving 40 ES regen per second flat is going to be nearly enough to get the Occultist back to playable. The Chieftain now provides 25% to fire damage over time multiplier instead of 15% more burning damage, providing more powerful burning characters unless they're already very heavily invested in damage over time multiplier. Yeah, that seems like that's just a change rather than a particularly more powerful or weaker overall setup. I think the Chieftain is solid. I just don't think it's quite good enough at the moment. The Berserker and Slayer were a little too generically powerful for attack builds, so some nodes have been nerfed. The Slayer's Bane of Legends node has had the value of attack and move speed granted reduced to 10%. That's a pretty big drawback, but it's not a crushing nerf. Overwhelm has had its base critical strike chance reduced to 7.5%. These are considerable nerfs, but they're not a crushing nerf bat. I would not be surprised if Slayer remains the best melee attack build in the game after these changes. The Berserker's Crave the Slaughter no longer grants a chance to deal double damage, with this bonus being moved to Warbringer if you've used a Warcry in the last 8 seconds. So I don't think Warbringer is going to be popular. Now, Crave the Slaughter will still be a compelling choice. I just don't think it will be amazing. And this is a modest nerf to Berserker, and probably will keep it below Slayer in popularity. Flawless Savagery now grants a lower value of critical strike chance for attacks, and slightly less crit multi. With all of that in mind, I think that Slayer remains the best of the melee attack ascendancies. Berserker is probably brought down to the level of Champion. Slayer still remains a level above Champion. And generally speaking, they're all looking pretty solid. Default to playing a Slayer, like any build that was a Slayer in 3.7 should still be able to be played in 3.8 and will still be very good. It just won't be as absurd as Cyclone Slayer was in 3.7. The Trickster's Ghost Dance passive was providing a bit too much defense for a single notable, so chance to evade, reduced damage taken, and amount of energy shield recovered have all been lowered. Yet, we all know that Trickster's Ghost Dance was too good, and I still think that the Trickster is in a very solid place. Ascendant has had passives related to many of the adjusted ascendancies above changed. For example, the Saboteur notable now provides more elemental penetration than before. A Necromancer mode now penalizes offerings on you less and grants additional area of effect if you have eaten a corpse recently. Yeah, all of that seems interesting. Okay, now we have some discussion of veiled modifiers. Now, I'm going to say that I think that it was a good thing to have some of these veiled modifiers being genuinely rare, but I don't like the changes that have been made, but I also don't agree with most of the things that people have been saying about this matter. So, what were my thoughts on veiled mods? The biggest problem with veiled mods is that players, broadly speaking, don't understand how that the most efficient way to unlock them is to run betrayal content in tier 12 and higher maps. The reason for that is that you will get much more unveiling XP from unveiling a tier 3 version of a mod than you will get from unveiling a tier 1 version. This is true for all of the mods that have multiple levels. It is, however, not necessarily true for the mods that have only one level, such as the glove physical to elemental conversion mods. So, let's have a look at the changes that have been made. Firstly, modifiers granted only by items from specific syndicate members now require half as many unveils to learn to craft. They're also more likely to appear as one of the potential modifiers. So what do I think there? This means that basically these will become, rather than these being a major reward for focusing on focusing on content around a specific master, they're now going to be a chore that you're just going to feel, oh yeah, I've just got to get this out of the way. It'll be like a Pantheon. It's like, oh yeah, I don't really care about this that much. I need to do it. It's a small upgrade to my character's crafting ability, so I'll just get it out of the way, rather than the way that it used to be, where it was like a significant milestone when you earned it, that you felt like you'd achieved something. However, some of them were some of them were just not worth the effort to unveil. So, for instance, Eiling gives percentage increased physical and chaos damage. The numbers just aren't there. It's not a very good mod, so no one really cares about it. I don't really like the idea of just making them easy to get, because I think we've seen what happens when things are easier to get. They just end up being less significant when you earn them. Modifiers that are only found on less common item types, or that are limited to only 1 or 2 item types, are now much more likely to appeal as unveiling options. This I'm actually more open to. These were where there were where I think there were some really justified complaints about these. This is things like there's a charge modifier on quivers. There's the glove mods that provide elemental conversion. These were actually things that you really, really struggled to get. And additionally, there wasn't really a second best option to fall back on. Flask modifiers unveiled only from the unique flask now only require a single unveil to unlock. Yeah, that is a sensible change. So that means that when you beat Katarina, there's a real reward for doing so, in that you get the flask unveil immediately. Now, the intent is that it shouldn't be necessary for a character to learn every single crafting recipe each league, but that we want to make it more easy to get a specific modifier you'd like to craft. We'll continue to monitor this. Now, I think that it should be, at least my feeling for how crafting should work, highly deterministic crafting like the unveiling is. I feel that should be changed a little bit, so that actually players should often be missing out on multiple crafting options and making do with a second best option, making do with a third best, or whatever. And that's something that I think we're missing at the moment. So take, for instance, with weapons. If you're using a physical damage attack weapon, chances are you are not using a physical damage attack weapon that has the best combination of mods available in the game on it. You might have a weapon that has one of merciless, tyrannical, Tacites, or maybe even one tier lower than Merciless, which from memory might be Vicious. You'll have one of these mods, plus you'll have a reasonable tier of physical damage, of flat physical damage, and a reasonable tier of attack speed. That's the sort of weapon that you're going to be using. If you have access to the perfect weapon all the time, then you run out of things you can improve. Veiled modifiers, by virtue of how, crafting in general in this game, by virtue of how deterministic it is, it ends up that once you earn a craft, there's not really anything more. There's no more reason to engage with the veiled system. So, what do I think the economic impacts of these changes are going to be? Well, in previous leagues, veiled items have always been worth picking up and worth selling. I think this is going to be the case for the first couple of days of a league. After that, I think they're just going to be things that are objectively correct to leave on the ground. That's going to be a change that's going to happen because they've been made more common, and so that's going to then devalue Jun missions, or at least it's going to devalue one of the major rewards from the Jun missions. Anyways, I know there's a lot of people that disagree with me on this, but I think it's a shame that a major step of late game character crafting capability is being removed here and is being trivialized so that it just becomes a small little hurdle like completing a Pantheon, rather than being a major step where it feel like you've achieved something big. Other changes. Now here there's a couple of big things and a couple of real what the fuck lines. So, packs of monsters that spawn with rare monsters now have a single shared modifier from the rare, as well as more life, more damage, more experience, and more item rewards. They'll make a rare monster encounter more rewarding and able to provide a greater challenge. This I really want to see in practice. This sounds like a big change that will affect the game from the start to the finish. And I'm really interested to see how it plays out. I think this could be a significant boost to monster power at all tiers of content. The other thing that's going to come up is that because I think that it is pretty common for monsters to spawn as part of one of these packs, like a pack that has a rare in it, having more experience and more item rewards from all of these packs is going to be a real game changer. One thing in particular, if this increases the amount of maps that drop, that's going to be really transformative on the economy. One of the things in Legion League that hasn't really been discussed in this Balance Manifesto is that there were a whole lot of strategies that you could play where you abused the ability to do only part of a map and then to leave it after you do a small amount of it. So this was in Glacier in particular. People would go into a Glacier, do the Legion Monolith, then just leave the map. You didn't need, because you were getting so many maps dropping for you, you didn't need to fight the boss. You didn't even feel remotely rewarded for doing so because you had all of the map drops you needed. You were amassing more maps than you could use, and that's going away. That meant that you didn't need to go into the second half of the map. So I think that if this results in an increase in map over sustain, it will also allow players to seriously abuse that. There's a number of other maps. It's not just Glacier. I mean, Glacier got called out a lot because it was the one that wasn't the first one people made videos on. That was City Square. But there's a number of maps that have very predictable event spawn locations. Glacier was one. Atoll was another. Dunes was another. City Square was another. All these were maps that you could go into, you could get to the Legion Monolith, you could clear the Legion Monolith, and then you could leave the map. And you could do this entire process in, depending on your character's speed, between 45 seconds and 75 seconds. And this strategy dominated the economy of Legion League, and it was made possible by the massive map over sustain in the league. If this increases maps over sustain, there'll be more ways to abuse it in the future. Some other ways that people have abused map over sustain in the past. In Harbinger League, I was a fairly weak player. I was just getting to Shaper Guardians for my first time, but I couldn't do hard Guardian mods. Harbinger had the highest map sustain of any league ever in the game's history, and so what niche did I find for myself? I would run tier 16 maps as white maps. So I would just take a scour and go approach to tier 16 maps, run a Forge of the Phoenix, grab the fragment of the Phoenix, and then I'd be done. I'd then go and I'd run my next map. This was a strategy that only worked because map over sustain was so high that even though I would be losing maps out of these runs, I'd then be able to sell my Shaper fragments in order to purchase beachhead maps, and I'd run those beachheads and they would just vomit out enormous amounts of additional tier 16 maps. This is a strategy that I used then, and to be honest, it feels somewhat like cheating. You know, you're engaging with the map, you're getting one of the key rewards of the tier 16 map, the Guardian fragment, but with the challenge basically nerfed to oblivion because there are no map mods on it. There are plenty of other strategies that can be used to exploit a scenario in which there is map over sustain, and so I'm somewhat nervous about this change. Monster accuracy has been lowered, as 3.7.0's accuracy and evasion calculation change resulted in monsters being noticeably more likely to hit a character with medium investment in evasion. This character brings an evasion-focused character back to the previous evade chance against monsters, though characters with low evasion will still be more likely to be hit than in 3.7.0. Okay, so this is something that I was looking at previously, and I think makes me even more interested in going a really high evasion raider character as my league starter, and that's what I think I'm going to do. Basically, you know, like the defenses provided by high evasion is just so easy for people to underestimate. We've also reduced the chance for a league mechanic that drops a random unique to drop a league-specific unique. This ended up being the most common source of league-specific uniques in some leagues. So, this means that there will be less random headhunter drops from Legion monoliths than there were. So, I think this only really refers to Legion monoliths and potentially to the Sacrifice Chamber in the Temple of Atzoatl. I could be wrong on that front, but they're the ones that come to mind. We've also increased the speed that the breach... Oh yeah, this change just blows my mind why they've done this. This is the craziest and weirdest and yeah, just most unbelievable decision that's been made here. We've increased the speed that breach expands in endgame breach domains. This lets you clear through a breach domain faster than before. We've increased the amount of time that you start with in elemental and physical breaches in the endgame breach domains to compensate for this faster expansion, so you'll have just as much total time to complete the breach. The amount of time you start with in a Chaos Breach domain has not changed, and thus will be more challenging. We've improved life scaling on the bosses to be more consistent across levels, increased density of monsters in the Breach domains, removed the increased life mod from the Breach domains, and increased the base life of monsters in the Breach domains to compensate. This will even out the challenge in pure Breach domains. Prior to this change, the bosses of the Physical and Chaos Breaches had less life than the Elemental Breach bosses in pure Breach domains. Okay, so what we've got here. So Chayula is being brought up to be a bit harder in the pure Chayula Breach stones, but the XP per minute in pure Breach stones, not necessarily Chaos ones, but no, actually it does include Chayula. The XP per minute that you get from running these Breach stones is being increased. There is no justification for buffing them as they're doing here. I really don't see why you would even consider this a reasonable decision to make. These were already so much better than maps, and this is coming on top of the decision to remove Beyond from the pool of Zana mods. So this means that there is less reason to map at endgame and more reasons to do the very predictable content of Purified Breach Stones, which then get bought from other players. Purified Breach Stones are a common source of scamming in the game from the various rotations and services that get run. So yeah, I think that this change really, I think, should just be reverted. I think this is a bad change for the game, and I don't understand why there is any desire to increase the rate that XP is granted from Purified Breach Stones. I think they're already somewhere between overpowered and absurdly overpowered, and yeah, that just makes no sense. We made adjustments to a large number of unique items based on their use. For example, Poet's Pen triggered spell now has a cooldown of 150 milliseconds down from 250, and it only triggers on finishing an attack rather than starting one because of animation cancelling. Blasphemer's Grasp now grants 4% to damage over time multiplier for ailments for each Elder item equipped, instead of 15% increased damage with ailments. Ouch, that seems like it's going to be less for most players. This concludes all the major balance changes we're wanting to discuss today. There are many smaller changes that you'll be able to read about in the patch notes tomorrow. Hopefully you've enjoyed this look at the upcoming balance changes, and we look forward to playing with you all in the upcoming Blight League. So there's a lot of things in here that look really interesting and exciting. A couple of things that made me really scratch my head, and a couple of things that, like the veiled item, nerfs to veiled item rarity will be things that will be popular with a lot of players, although I'm not a huge fan of them. But overall, I'm still definitely excited for this league. The Mana for Spellcasters change is going to be really interesting, and the watching to see how people adapt to the changes to Tornado Shot in the Deep Delve meta is something I'm really interested to start theory crafting on myself and to give some serious thought to. In any case, there's undoubtedly questions that this has raised. This has been an extreme example of verbal diarrhea to essay length discussion of this development manifesto. It's gone for 71 minutes, which is longer than I thought it would have. So undoubtedly there's going to be questions, there's going to be comments, and there's going to be requests for a too long didn't read version. If you've got any of those to make, definitely fire away below. Otherwise, I hope you have a good one, and I will see you in the Blight League.